Again, the topic is body cameras. This time we will discuss implementation of a body camera program. We're joined today by 4 experts in this area. We'll hear first from Johanna Miller, Advocacy Director, New York Civil Liberties Union. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good morning to the co-chairs and the members of the task force. Thank you for having us here today to talk about this emerging, developing technology and its importance. As was mentioned on the previous panel, 6 months from now, we could be having a slightly different conversation. But when it comes to implementation, the truth is the departments are ahead of the policy right now. The departments that are adopting this are ahead of best practices policy. A lot of the policy is being developed by commercial entities right now, the companies that provide the cameras, that provide the data storage. So I think it's really important that we do take this moment to be deliberate, to sort of take a breath and think about how we implement these things in the smartest way possible. The NYCLU is the New York State affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization with 50,000 members across the state. Our mission is to defend and promote the fundamental principles, rights, and values embodied in the Bill of Rights and the U.S. Constitution and the Constitution of the State of New York. A key component of our work is to promote transparency and accountability for police departments, including the nation's largest municipal force, the NYPD, which not coincidentally has recently announced a pilot program for body cameras for about 400 officers who are going to be wearing the cameras on a voluntary basis, and is just in the process of issuing guidance for how that pilot will roll out. We're hopeful, like a lot of reformers, that police body-worn cameras, or BWCs, represent an important step forward in law enforcement reform that ultimately protects both officers and the public. And as the sister of a police officer, I find myself wearing both hats very often. We're heartened that emerging policies for using BWCs seem to reflect significant overlap between what is good for officers and what is good for the communities they serve. For both groups, transparency, accountability, privacy, and reliability are hallmarks of a successful program. As was mentioned before, there are early studies indicating that knowing or the knowledge that a BWC is in use can actually improve the behavior of civilians and police in street encounters. We think there needs to be more studies to determine whether this effect is real. If replicated evidence indicates that it is real, then investing in BWCs could actually represent one of the most significant steps in progress we could take in improving police-community relations. Our primary recommendation for this task force and for the administration is to fund rigorously designed pilot programs with published evidence and published results so that we can catch up with the technology, so that we can establish best practices, and so that individual departments aren't out in front of the research, so to speak. The administration, we believe, should restrict any grant programs to departments, to those departments that have a deliberate, clear statement of their purpose for adopting BWCs. So for example, a statement of purpose that BWCs aren't going to be used in surveillance operations and that they will be used to monitor law enforcement interactions with the public, but not, for example, First Amendment or demonstration activity. The programs must be designed to maximize officer accountability, which, and I don't want to repeat what was said before, but it's so important to eliminate officer discretion to not record interactions where they're required to record. Enforceable policies need to include evidentiary presumptions against officers in disciplinary hearings or other cases who fail to activate the camera when they're required to do so. In addition, retention, deletion, and storage policies need to favor access by subjects of recordings and provide ample opportunity to use those recordings. But the flip side of that is recordings of nothing, recordings of interactions that don't lead to a case, that aren't evidentiary, or that just merely capture casual interactions between officers and civilians need to be deleted quickly in order to protect privacy, to minimize the risk of improper disclosure, but also to minimize the chance that those things will be disclosed through, as was discussed before, public records laws that are not created to minimize that privacy risk. Finally, BWCs, it's so important that they're not seen as a silver bullet. It's been mentioned, but I think it's really important to think about introducing a BWC program into a police department that has a broken discipline system or a discipline system that needs oversight or needs fixing or needs work can really be counterproductive, could really lead to the evaporation of public trust. If there's video evidence and yet the disciplinary procedures still have a lack of independent oversight or a lack of responsiveness to what's being seen on the videos, we're going to lose public trust, and those cameras will be essentially useless. I also want to mention the importance of minimizing the opportunity for abuse of privacy in use of the cameras. For example, we believe it's very important that people be given notice, either through a visual cue or through the officer's explanation that they are being recorded, particularly when working with community members, witnesses, and obviously crime victims. And that in a lot of cases, those victims and witnesses especially should be given the opportunity to actually consent to that recording, and that consent be captured on the camera itself. I'll mention it again, a lot of our work in New York City is about protecting the right to demonstrate in public, and it's something that we often clash with the NYPD over how protests are monitored, how protesters are treated in the street. And we have, over the years, had a lot of issues with surveillance of peaceful demonstrators. The NYPD has a technical response unit that videotapes peaceful protesters. They are under court decree to delete videos where there's no evidence of anyone breaking a law. Obviously, that has to apply to body cameras, but even so, those recordings of peaceful demonstrations need to be deleted quickly. So I'll wrap up. We do think that body cameras should be a win-win for everyone involved, but the policies that are in place for implementation will really make the difference.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll hear from Ken Miller, Chief of the Greenville Police Department.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'll begin my remarks by stating that I'm not Johanna's brother, and we haven't had any great debates on this issue to date. Policing a free society is complex. It requires of the police and the public equal measures of restraint and submission to law and lawful authority. When police abuse power and discretion, or when members of the public fail to submit to it, conflict thrives. But my experience tells me that the underlying cause of many of these problems that we have is in the way we interact. And by that I mean the lack of understanding, compassion, or respect that we show one another. We have an obligation to manage our side of that equation better than we currently do. Police agencies are wildly inconsistent in how they collect and analyze and learn from complaint, use of force, and early intervention data. Often there are insufficient data or staff resources to produce a learning environment where analyses actually inform policies, practices, and training. Since we don't fully trust our systems to work for us, body cameras have become more popular, serving as independent witnesses. In Greensboro, where I served for 4 years as chief, we implemented police body cameras across more than 500 field officers in 2013. Our goal was to improve interactions and address complaints. We worked through a litany of privacy, legal, retention, training, and financial concerns to ensure that we met community expectations. Mr. Greenwood testified before you about the unnamed city that he's working with that has had issues about only releasing body cameras in complaint investigations or that they're part of a criminal investigation or personnel record, and we couldn't. That's Greensboro. So I worked in that and lived through that. Also in 2013, the Police Executive Research Forum held a summit in Washington, D.C. following a survey that they conducted with police agencies across the country. That summit was to discuss these issues, and it produced an incredibly insightful publication to guide decision-making with respect to body camera implementation. We believe that these systems add value by elevating the quality of behavior on both sides of the camera, providing greater clarity to settle disputed facts. But cameras and early intervention systems alone cannot produce the fair and impartial policing or the relationship development that I believe this task force seeks to promote. While these systems can provide evidence of compliance with policies and training that promote fair and impartial policing, they cannot guarantee it. Through its funding programs, the federal government is uniquely positioned to influence systemic changes to produce this kind of environment. And so my recommendations are really focused in that way. My first recommendation is to avoid mandatory body-worn camera laws. The many legal, policy, training, and resource concerns vary by jurisdiction and must be locally resolved. Poor implementation will create more problems than are solved by the use of the technology. The marketplace, I believe, will drive development and use, and growth can be encouraged through funding support and political processes. My second recommendation is that we require that grant-funded agencies adopt policies, practices, and training that produce fair and impartial policing. Some of the policies and practices that should be included prohibit the use of race, ethnicity, or other class factors as general indicators of criminal activity and subsequent police action. Requiring open complaint processes and adoption of all biased policing complaints for investigation instead of referring them as court matters. Track and review all stops and searches and prohibit consent searches lacking reasonable suspicion. Require in-car or body-worn video recordings of any encounter of an investigative nature. Incorporate review of video, stops, and searches into the functions of an early intervention system. I will also say that we should, and grant-funded agencies should, promote training on fair and impartial policing, conflict resolution, which is not a part of most state required courses, legitimacy, and procedural justice. Another recommendation is that we should require state justice academies to integrate these three training programs into recruit and in-service training programs. Recommendation 4, conduct longitudinal studies to determine the impact of body camera implementation upon frequency of force and complaints. In Greensboro, we saw early reductions in both by about 50% in complaints and by about a third in or quarter in uses of force. However, since that initial implementation, we have seen those numbers creep back up, although to below pre-camera levels. And then my last recommendation is that police organizations should develop their policy and work through the issues locally before they ever implement the first body camera. Failure to do that will result in huge problems moving forward for agencies. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Kenton Rainey, the Chief of the Bay Area Rapid Transit.
Director Davis, Chairwoman Robertson, Chairman Ramsey. I'm Kenton Rainey of the San Francisco Bay Area Rapid Transit Police Department, and it's a pleasure and honor for me to appear before this task force. BART started its research in body cameras in September of 2011, and formal implementation began in 2012. A little background, our agency is the 5th largest transportation system in the country. It has 104 miles of linear trackway, travels through 4 counties and 26 cities. My tenure as chief began after a tragedy that garnered international attention. During the early morning hours of January 1st of 2009, a BART police officer fatally shot Oscar Grant III in the back on a BART platform after officers responded to a fight in progress. That incident was captured on our closed-circuit TV cameras, but numerous citizens who were on trains also captured that incident on cell phone footage. This incident led to the arrest, prosecution, and conviction of that officer. Also, street protests, acts of civil disobedience, and disruption of public meetings occurred as well. It also led to the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE, to conduct a top-to-bottom management performance audit of BART PD and its policy and practices. 25 major recommendations were made by NOBLE to BART to undertake in order to reestablish public accountability and regain the public trust. In my opinion, those recommendations contained in that management audit can serve as a blueprint for this task force and for any law enforcement agency trying to establish and maintain the public trust. I was hired in June of 2010 with a specific mandate to implement the recommendations. As I moved forward, however, a series of incidents occurred that challenged our efforts. We had 2 additional officer-involved shootings and 1 high-profile tasering incident that all led to the public outcry, again, looking at our legitimacy as an agency. Determined not to let our report sit on the shelf, I also made the following additional key observations as I went forward. 3 of the suspects previously mentioned in the incident all had histories of mental illness. It also seemed that a number of our calls for service that resulted in some type of conflict involved suspects who were apparently homeless or suffering from mental illness. Increasingly, citizens would stop and record our interactions on their cell phones and upload these recordings on social media sites. Although we had an adequate CCTV camera system, it was not capable of capturing sound. An increasing number of our officers were already carrying their own body camera equipment and taping their enforcement encounters to protect themselves, quote, from them, false complaints. And finally, after the Oscar Grant tragedy, there seemed to be an expectation by the public that video evidence was needed to exonerate our personnel whenever there's a question regarding their actions. What I would advise any law enforcement head in any place USA, if you're thinking about implementing a body camera program, I will refer you to the COPS office and Police Executive Research Forum document implementing body-worn camera program and recommendations and lesson learned. Ken already referenced it. We both participated in the making of this document. It has numerous recommendations that anyone that's looking at this type of program, the questions that you're going to encounter, it has suggestions and tips that you need to look at. But more importantly, I think it's important that everyone understand that the body camera is a tool. That's all it is a tool. And it's a tool that will measure how effective your fair and impartial policing training is working, your training, if you have any, regarding de-escalating conflict encounters. Majority of my personnel, now 85%, have been trained in crisis intervention training. Do you have an internal use of force review where a supervisor responds to the scene anytime force is used? Do you have a complaint procedure where you accept all complaints? And finally, I would say I support citizen oversight, an independent body that keeps checks and balances on our agency to make sure that we are adhering to what the public expects of us. How the police are perceived by minorities is one of the most serious problems confronting our democracy in the nation today. Establishing and maintaining the public's trust is the cornerstone of implementing community policing philosophy. One of the first bricks that has to be laid in community policing foundation is transparency. Although not the panacea, the use of body cameras can go a long way to ensuring transparency. More importantly, body cameras serve as a visual feedback loop that your accountability systems are adhering to 21st century constitutional policing principles.
Thank you, sir. Next, we will hear from Richard Van Houten, Sergeant, Fort Worth Police Officers Association.
Thank you. I am the president of the Fort Worth Police Officers Association, which is why I'm here to address you. And I do appreciate the opportunity. The law enforcement profession is rapidly changing, and it is imperative that input be sought from all perspectives as decisions are being made to formulate the roadmap that will lead us all into the 21st century of policing. Specifically, if the boots on the ground do not have a voice in the implementation of policy, procedure, and new technology, there will be resistance to the implementation of that technology, regardless of how beneficial it may be to the profession and the citizens being served. The end user of any tool must have confidence in that tool and the desired result of its use in order to willingly deploy the tool as intended. The law enforcement profession is continuously evolving in an effort to deliver the services that citizens demand and deserve. Advances in technology are being developed at an astounding rate, and it is incumbent on the leaders of our profession to analyze the various products while always keeping in mind the possible impact on the constitutional and due process rights of the public and the police. Body cameras are inevitable in our profession. Thus, it is necessary that all decision makers implement them with caution, making every effort to ensure they are only used as a tool to help bridge the gap between perception and reality in regards to officer interactions with the public. It is a common belief in public safety labor that we represent the very finest that our society has to offer. Any individual that would willingly go into harm's way in the protection of others is truly a remarkable and selfless person. Many of us in the law enforcement community have been advocating for years for the ability to use body camera technology. We know intuitively that body cameras have positive effects on any situation that our officers find themselves in. In the end, everyone, citizen and officer, behave better when they know a camera is recording. Body cameras are a technology that has just recently become available to law enforcement. Currently, the Fort Worth Police Department, approximately 1,500 officers serving just under 800,000 residents, is a national leader in the use of body cameras, with 595 cameras already purchased, 488 of those currently deployed, and a pending needs assessment for an additional 250 cameras. While admittedly our policy is a constant work in progress, it was developed in a collaborative effort between management and labor. During the policy development and implementation process, we quickly realized that we were dealing with an emerging technology that would have vast implications that would have to be addressed to create a sustainable advancement in how we serve the public. For example, recording of minors and the retention of those recordings is an identified issue that must be resolved. Officers interact with the public daily and in various environments. Many of those environments have minors present, and while they may not be the focus of the interaction, their image is recorded because they are present. The majority of states, if not all states, closely regulate the recordings, photographing, and retention of data by law enforcement concerning minors. This has not been resolved. The release of video under open records and the time-consuming nature of redacting all recorded information from that video that is currently required to be released when properly requested is another issue. Redacting information from videos currently performed frame by frame, making it extremely costly and time-consuming to be released. These are just a couple of examples of unforeseen issues that must be resolved to create a sustainable policy for the use of body cameras. Through cooperative relationships between management and labor, a truly realistic body camera policy will be achieved in Fort Worth, Texas. It should be noted that we have experienced that complaints on police officers have been overwhelmingly proved false due to the use of these body cameras. That's our experience with them. Going into the implementation. The implementation of body cameras cannot be done in a vacuum. It is imperative that there be dialogue between all of the stakeholders and affected parties. Current knowledge of body camera technology and implementation that conforms to the various state and national statutes is merely the tip of the iceberg. It will take an ongoing effort by all to discover and properly address every issue that arises. There must be an acknowledgement by all involved in the implementation process that body cameras cannot be a Pandora's box, nor will they be a panacea. In order for successful implementation of body cameras, an understanding must be gained by all that a body camera is merely a tool with a very specific purpose and limitations. Law enforcement leaders are stringent advocates for officers' rights. The core function of a public safety union is the advocacy for pay, benefits, working conditions, and due process rights, while being true to the primary goal of all police officers, which is honoring the oath of office we swore to put the safety of citizens above all else. The use of body cameras is a technology that will be able to document an incident from a single perspective. It must be used within the parameters for which it is intended. It cannot, nor should it be allowed to be used to micromanage an officer's daily activities for disciplinary purposes. Fishing expeditions by management will significantly erode the trust that is necessary for officers to record their interactions with the public. I must remind everyone that police officers today took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. They did not, however, relinquish their own constitutional rights in that process. Organizations that are directly advocating for the use of body cameras from the sole standpoint of police reform, transparency, and accountability for police have to recognize that this technology is merely a tool with that limited ability. Body cameras are not, nor will they ever be, the global eye in the sky that delivers an all-knowing account for any and all police encounters. It is a two-dimensional image from a specific point of view that will never capture the entire picture or even see everything that an officer will see. It will never tell the complete story of any event, and due to these limitations, it has to be viewed in the context of its limitations. For recommendations, policy development. While it is wise for model policy recommendations to be developed on a national level, it should only be developed as a rough template, with the local control being given to the individual policing agencies, entrusting them with the ability and discretion to customize the policy to fit within their unique departmental structure. No policing agency accomplishes their mission in the same fashion. Whether state to state or city to city, all are governed and operate differently. Some agencies have labor contracts that have been negotiated over decades, and others simply governed by civil service rules or a version of local charter governance. The individual agencies should be highly encouraged to seek input in the policy development process from their local labor leaders, citizens, local chapters of the ACLU, their faith-based partners, and local legal departments. Implementing body cameras in most cases is a mandatory subject of bargaining and must be partnered with the labor union. Funding nationwide, public safety budgets are stressed and continue to be diminished. This task force must be mindful to not create unfunded mandates. Body camera technology is expensive, and the cost does not end with the purchase of the equipment alone. The greater ongoing cost is encountered with the storage, maintenance, and use of the data that must be preserved under stringent controls to comply with evidentiary protocols.
30-second trick.
Federal funding must be provided if the goal is to equip officers throughout the country with body cameras. Due to time constraints, everyone has a copy of this. Let me go into privacy accountability real quick. Accountability cuts both ways. Police officers are held accountable for their actions on a daily basis by their supervision and the policies agencies have enacted to allow for citizen complaints. Body cameras will disprove allegations against police officers in greater proportion than the technology will stain allegations. Members of public that provide false statements against police officers that are definitively disproven by video evidence should be held criminally accountable for their false allegations. For those that would argue that body cameras should solely be used for monitoring officer behavior, police reform, transparency, and accountability, an argument can and should be made that the counter is true as well. Body camera videos should be used as a tool for the truth to be recorded regardless of who is in the wrong, and in the greatest majority of the instances, the officer will be shown to have been acting in the right. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank all of you for your testimony. Before I turn to the other task force members for questions, I have one quick one for Ms. Miller. You mentioned in your testimony that video footage captured by an officer that does not involve any kind of negative interaction or crime that took place should be deleted as soon as possible. Do you have a time frame as to how long that should be maintained before deletion?
I don't have a time frame, but I do think there a lot of the departments that have policies in place so far have identified like flagging systems. So an officer could say, there was a stop and frisk at this point, and there was a summons at this point, and know that the rest of it was nothing. I think that needs to be reviewed, obviously. The officer can't just self-determine whether something is worth keeping or deleting, but after an appropriate amount of time for reviewing and realizing there's nothing on the footage, I think those should be deleted really within we're talking about a matter of days, I think.
Okay, thank you. First task force member asking questions is Connie Rice, followed by Sean Smoot.
Didn't realize I was going first. Thank you all very much for your testimony. It's very illuminating. I have one question. I had a lady come up to me from Watts, and she said, Miss Rice, if LAPD uses those cameras and the gangs see that I'm talking to police, I could end up dead. What discretion do the officers have to protect the public from retaliation from gangs if the gangs think that they're talking to the police? Or in other situations where the police know that the consequences of being on that camera can lead to the death of another human being. What's done right now, and what do you suggest as policy to protect the public and the police from footage that can be deemed dangerous?
If I may, one of the common approaches in most communities is to use Crime Stoppers or some sort of tip line. Those tips can be investigated, but the tipster is anonymous, remains anonymous, and the investigation works into that lead to try and produce or determine the viability of that lead, I guess what I'm trying to say. So I think using investigative tip lines is very, very helpful if somebody is concerned about that. Also,
if the public is going to be called a snitch, can the officer turn the camera off so there's no record of that interaction? Is that what happens now?
If I may, what happens now is, at least in Texas, due to open records laws, those have to be released. We've had instances where defense attorneys, especially in drug cases, have subpoenaed and requested open records and have obtained those videos, and it has placed those people in jeopardy. That's one of the primary reasons that we take the position that video evidence should only be released after it's used in a trial and all proceedings are completed.
I think it is, it's essential that in a non-hostile interaction with a community member who's a potential victim or witness, that person actually be able to withhold consent to be recorded. We can rely then on the old-fashioned means of capturing a witness statement that officers know how to do without the video evidence, where a community member is going to feel more comfortable and have a greater degree of trust when they're not being filmed. And I think your question also raises an important point that was touched on in the PERF report on body cameras, which was they talked about using the statements in order to prosecute where a victim recants. And I think it's really important that we think, particularly working with victim advocacy groups and domestic violence groups, that footage of a victim or witness never be used to coerce testimony where someone doesn't want to testify.
Thank you.
And we don't release any information from the ongoing investigation. But in addition, my personnel, the camera is not mandated to be on all the time. Only when they go into an enforcement encounter, or if they're going into a call for service that is likely to produce a enforcement encounter where a suspect is still at large. So the officers, they have the ability to turn the camera off, but they have to articulate why.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Sean Smoot, followed by Brian Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, all the witnesses. Your testimony's been very helpful this morning. I have two questions and two different kind of veins. In the state where I'm from, we currently use dash cameras predominantly. There's some experimental programs going on with body-worn cameras, but it's not a widely adopted tool yet. And under our law, if the video that's taken on a dash camera does not have evidentiary value for either no complaint was issued or there's not a civil case contemplated and it's not won't be used for a criminal case, after 90 days after the recording's done, it's deleted. And so I'm curious to know in your departments what your policy is with regard to retention, because I think, you know, one of the issues people are very concerned about from a privacy standpoint is, you know, I was pulled over, I got a speeding ticket 10 years ago. Is the video of my interaction someday going to be posted online or come up? So that's question number one, and that's to those of you who use the cameras in your jurisdictions. Question number two is for President Van Houten. I'm curious to know what you did, what your union did in terms of educating your members and building consensus with your members to embrace this technology. So,
in Greensboro, where we implemented the body-worn cameras, I believe our policy reflected 45 days if no complaint had come in, because we were concerned about the storage costs building, because it's a lot of video across 500 employees. So we set it for 45 days. If a complaint comes in, it gets locked. If it's used for court purposes, misdemeanors and felonies have different state retention rules. So you have to maintain that video until some defined period of time, 20 years, 3 years, I think, for misdemeanors, 20 years for felonies post conviction. So that has significant implications for the city. And in South Carolina, we have mostly dash cams. We have a few body-worn cameras that are used on our walk-in beats downtown, and the retention is 180 days on that video.
Along with your California, along with our State Records Retention Act, we also have a Peace Officer Bill of Rights that a complaint can come in up to 365 days, and we're obligated to investigate it. So we actually have retention schedules where when a video is tagged, it will delete unless we flag it through our third-party provider.
So does that happen at 366 days?
It's automatic unless we flag it.
Okay.
So to go into your second question, what we did in our implementation phase, and we're still admittedly in the implementation phase, we had to get buy-in from the boots on the ground, the officers. We began with about 50 cameras and sought volunteers. And as we encountered success cases, and yes, I consider a success case when a citizen files a complaint on an officer and that video conclusively proves that the complaint is false. That is a success in the eyes of the officers because their actions have been validated. And overwhelmingly, as we encounter those and we show conclusively that the officer's actions are in the right, you get more buy-in by further officers. And we just slowly rolled those out to the point where the first 200 cameras were now voluntarily out in the field. And then after that, bought another 200. And once we got to the point where there were no more voluntary officers that wanted them, then we went to the police academy and started issuing them to the recruits and started training, you know, during the whole process we were training the recruits, but we're training them how to police on camera, how to use it as a tool to help them in their job and help them in the delivery of service to the citizens. So started out voluntarily, got buy-in, and then went to a mandatory wear for new hires.
Thank you very much. Brian Stevenson, followed by Roberto Villasenor.
Yes, this is a question I think primarily for you, Ms. Miller. I'm really intrigued by this notion of consent. In the earlier panel, some of the members were really pushing us to minimize officer discretion in the implementation and use of these cameras. It seems to me a consent requirement is going to dramatically increase that discretion. And I'm wondering whether you think a distinction should be made or could be made between officers engaging in investigative work, talking to witnesses, gathering evidence, not really being in a situation where that issue is going to be triggered in the same way, versus officers who are in an active enforcement situation, and whether you think a consent requirement would be different in those two kinds of uses of law enforcement investigative tactics.
Yes, I completely agree with you. I think that distinction is necessary. We think there should be as little discretion as possible in recording, the necessity to record enforcement interactions. So absolutely. There shouldn't be necessarily a consent requirement there, although we do still believe that there should be notification. So people should know all the time if they're being recorded to, whatever extent that can be communicated. Obviously, sometimes the cameras are very obvious. Some people have suggested putting a color flag or something, or even like a little sign that says you being recorded, where the officer can't necessarily say, I'm about to record you. Certainly that the civilizing effect of the camera, if it proves to be true, only works if you know you're being recorded. But in terms of consent, I think that needs to be very narrow circumstances with witnesses or community members who are engaging with officers in a non-investigation way, and sort of casual conversation, or crime victims who have different sensitivities about being recorded.
Thank you very much. Roberto Villasenor, followed by Brittany Packnett.
And I guess I'm going to delve just a little deeper into that, Ms. Miller, because it does raise some interesting points. Now, when you talk about consent, oftentimes when officers are out on the scene and they're doing the exploratory initial investigation, they may not know the true involvement of everyone they're talking with. And so just to make sure I'm understanding, you're talking in situations where they know clearly they're talking to a witness. That's when the consent issue should be raised. But I guess you brought up one other point about the theory or the thought out there that recordings can be used to counter, let's say, domestic violence victims who recant their testimony later on. And you said it should never be used to coerce testimony. And I guess I have some questions about that, because oftentimes in domestic violence situations, for a variety of reasons studied quite in depth by psychologists, sociologists, victims will often recant after they're out of the emotion of the situation, and that keeps them in a dangerous situation where if we're able to follow through, we might be able to get assistance or prosecution of the guilty. So I'd like you to expand on why you don't think that would be a proper use to try and bring an individual who may be abusing someone to justice if we can't use that video to help them to go over that part.
So I'll just start by saying I'm not an expert on domestic violence situations, and I do think it's probably worthwhile for the task force to talk to someone who is about exactly how, best to accommodate victims in those situations. But specifically, the PERF report on body cameras contemplates this exact situation and talks specifically about using the camera evidence in order to prosecute where the victim doesn't want to testify. I think that is a slightly different situation than using the camera evidence in order to pressure or coerce a victim to do something that they're not comfortable doing. And I think that perhaps there's a line to be drawn there in order to build on trust, engagement with the police department of crime victims.
So that's a clarification of that I could appreciate, because in the initial statement, I thought you said if a victim says, I don't want to be recorded, the officer should shut that off. But there may be some distinctions that we need to make for particular events in case the victim recants later, and we want to get them into the system to provide some type of assistance for them to overcome that fear that particularly domestic violence causes. Use the video separate from the testimony of the witness.
I think that there may be instances where the camera actually puts up a barrier to cooperation and engagement and can create more fear. And so I think officers need to be trained, and clearly there are officers who are specialists in responding in domestic situations and work with social workers and other experts in making the most peaceful outcome in those situations. And I think that's going to be really important here. And also officers need to be trained to, there may be situations where someone says, I really don't want to be recorded, but the officer says, well, I know this is going to go one way, and it's very important that I do record, and I think there needs to be room for that to happen, but it needs to be governed by pretty strict policies, and it needs to probably leave the least amount of discretion to that 1 second gut feeling, right? You don't necessarily want the officers to be making that, okay, am I in category A or B or C right now, but actually creating some bright line policies where they have the ability to turn the camera off if they believe it's in the best interest of a victim or a witness.
Thank you.
Ken, did you want to add to that?
I did. Thank you so much. In Greensboro, where we had a lot of discussion around that issue, when do you turn them off? How do you, at what point? And so in terms of responding to events, and in many cases, this scenario will occur when we respond to a call for service as opposed to self-initiated activity. And so we respond to a call for service, and you have kind of the emergency response. The cameras are rolling. And once you get that scene locked down into an investigative mode, if you will, crime scene takes up, it's stable. The supervisor gives the order to cut the cameras. And if you leave them going for the entire duration, you may have people who are on scene for 8, 10, 12 hours, potentially even longer. And so somebody's got to review every second of that footage for investigation, for prosecution. If you have 10, 12, 15, 20 people on a scene, it's an incredible burden, not only for police and detectives trying to work through a case, but for prosecutors and defense attorneys, and it really drives up the overall cost of managing these events. So that's where we drew the line, because there has to be some measure of practicality in what we do. So in the case of the question that you've posed, I think that a lot of the witness testimony would then be coming out differently and not necessarily on recordings.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to
Brittany.
add something.
Okay.
Something that we found, very unfortunately, in public transportation, one of our #1 crimes is domestic violence on the train and throughout our system. And we do leave the cameras running until we determine who is the aggressor, if we're going to make an arrest, and then once that body is taken away, that's when we turn it off. So however long it takes, and again, unless there is a bona fide reason that the officer can articulate why they're turning the camera off, the cameras run, and we expect all the officers that respond to the scene to have those cameras on throughout that incident.
Thank you very much. Brittany Packnett, followed by Jose Lopez.
Hi, thank you very much. So I have two quick questions. One, and interestingly enough, today is about technology and social media, and one of the conversations that's been happening on Twitter as we speak is about perspective versus the viewing of actions. And so we heard on the last panel about why it might be important to actually place the camera on or near the head instead of on the chest or the lapel. And several people have brought up the very good point that that provides a lens into the officer's perspective, but actually doesn't provide video evidence of the officer's actions. So my question is, should we always potentially be thinking about body-worn cameras as a policy solution when they are always paired with dash cams or some other kind of camera that provides a bit more of a holistic perspective of the incident?
I guess I'll start. We have thousands of closed-circuit TV cameras throughout our system. Now we have introduced body cameras, and I've been in law enforcement 35 years. And I remember when I first went out of patrol, I was given a tape recorder. And whenever you went into some type of enforcement contact, or if you're making an arrest or whatever, if you didn't turn in a microset recording with that packet, people looked at you a little strange. From perspective, whether the officer wears it on their head, on the lapel, on their chest, I want the officer to wear it wherever they're most comfortable. The most important thing to me, along with the video, if we don't have the video, because a lot of times when a confrontation occurs, it gets knocked off, is the sound. And what happened, what brought us there in the first place, how it started. One of the problems that we found in our implementation was when the officers were turning them on. A lot of them were waiting, even though we had the buffer, because we went with a Taser Exxon Flex, and they backed up, they still waited too long to turn them on. And so we did retraining and corrected that. When they got that call for service, we wanted them to turn that camera on. When they saw an individual that they wanted to contact, we wanted them to turn that camera on so it captured that initial contact, that initial greeting, how they were interacting with the individual.
You know, if I might add to that, I go back to a statement I've made, many people on this panel have made, as well as the previous panel. This technology is a tool, simply a tool. It's not all-encompassing. It's not going to be all-encompassing, eye in the sky, and give all of the data that some people think it should. The fact of the matter is, and I go back to an earlier question you asked about citizen oversight. This country already has citizen oversight in these situations, and that is in the judicial system, the grand jury. The grand jury looks at each and every piece of evidence holistically, but as individually. The video and the audio produced from these is a tool that goes into that cog of that system. Just because the general public may not have the knowledge that the grand jury system or the grand jurors did have when they made their decision, doesn't mean that decision is wrong and needs to be replaced with some type of other third-party investigation. But going back to the specific point here, this is merely one piece. Yeah, it'd be great if we have another camera in the car, but suspects don't always line up perfectly in front of every camera available to be arrested.
So actually my second question is to you, Mr. Van Houten. I used to be a teacher. I taught elementary school. And I'm currently in a position where I train teachers. And so this conversation about accountability is extremely important to me because I believed that as a teacher I should be held extremely accountable given the fact that I had 30 children sitting in front of me every single day and I had the responsibility of molding their brains and had access to them. Similarly, I believe that this conversation about accountability is critical for our law enforcement given the oath that has already been referred to by you as being sworn before law enforcement walks into a community. So my question is in that vein, because you said that one of the tools that you have used to increase buy-in with body cams has actually been showing officers that false citizen complaints can actually be proven false with the use of that camera. My worry, though, is that could have the adverse effect of encouraging buy-in for body cams for the use of self-preservation instead of for the use of legitimacy, community policing, trust across community and police officers. So my question is, how do you prevent that adverse effect to ensure that the buy-in doesn't, that law enforcement officers are not buying into the idea that I'm going to use this camera just to protect myself, but also buying into the idea that I'm using this as a means of truth and trust building with the community?
Aren't they all one and the same? The fact of the matter is, everybody should want the truth of a certain encounter to come out. If this tool is being worn and it provides the truth of what happened during that situation, doesn't that go to the heart of legitimacy? Doesn't that go to the heart of everything you just said? Despite no matter what the motivation might be for the officer to wear the tool and to have the buy-in, the fact that that is present should go to the truth of the matter.
So my apologies, I don't think I was totally clear. So earlier, Mr. Lopez asked about issues of tampering with evidence, right, or disabling your camera has been referred to, right? And so when we think about the motivation for self-preservation being strong enough in certain situations to actually engage in those kinds of ways, how do we ensure that that kind of buy-in doesn't result in those kind of actions? That's specifically what I was referring to.
Ken, did you want to add something to that, too?
Afterward.
Okay.
Yeah, first off, I'm not going to sit up here and defend anybody's bad actions. You know, the fact of the matter is, if the tool works and there's voluntary buy-in, no matter what the motivation is, they are going to want to record the incident as accurately as possible, because they themselves want to prove that their actions were right, legitimate, and just in that situation. You know, no officer goes out there and says, I'm going to try and fool the camera and try to be unjust to a citizen. You know, I just don't see that happening. I think as people realize that this device is able to tell the truth of an encounter, no matter who is wrong or who is right, and that people will look at it and listen to it, I think it's self-validating.
Thank you. I'd like to respond to both parts of that question. First part, in terms of the perspective of the officer and the lapel versus head.
Can you draw your
Sorry,
mic
is
a
it
little
not
closer?
close enough? I just hear echo here. But the lapel versus the head mount, I think organizations have to address that so that you get a good perspective. But you mentioned that pairing the dash and the body cameras together, if costs were not an option, I think that would be ideal. But you've essentially then created a situation where you have 2 times the equipment cost, 2 times the storage costs, 2 times the review costs, and 2 times the redaction costs. And that's, again, just a tremendous, tremendous burden for local organizations. And then to get at the truth matter, they are important to get to the truth. But justice isn't just about the truth. And I think that's something that we're hearing from our communities. It's more than just the truth. Just because I can use force doesn't mean that necessarily I should. Just because I can make an arrest doesn't mean that I necessarily should. Just because I can write a ticket doesn't mean that it's in the best interest to do so. And so I think that the cameras, if the review processes are right, despite the fact that the truth can come out, The cameras, whether they're dash cams or whether they're body cameras or they're just audio recordings, I think that those things can actually help us sort through the facts of what took place and whether or not the actions were appropriate, not only under the law and that we know exactly what took place, but what can we do to learn from that experience to improve, even if the officers followed the law. It's more than that in terms of relationships.
And I just wanted to add, you can't get to truth without trust and respect, and that's why we're here today. At least I feel that there is certain segments of our community that we absolutely need their cooperation in order to do our jobs in an effective manner. There's a lack of trust. When there's a lack of trust, that means there's a lack of respect, and it goes both ways. And something that I disagree with one of my colleague here on this panel, I think civilian oversight helps to provide that. Law enforcement are paramilitary organizations, and we're quick to tout that. And every branch of our military is headed by a civilian, not a sworn member of that branch of government. So we should be willing to accept that type of oversight as well.
Thank you very much. Jose Lopez, followed by Tracy Mears, who will pose the last question to this panel.
Yeah, a couple of questions. So we just heard from Mr. Van Houten on the kind of body camera program that there needs to be voluntary buy-in. In Mr. Miller's statement, we heard that we have to avoid mandatory body camera laws. And so I'm just wondering, when we're talking about this issue of trust and fairness, if we're talking about a voluntary rollout, does this impact the perception of fairness from both officers and from community members? Are officers thinking, how come in my jurisdiction I have to be monitored, but next door officers there don't? Are community members thinking, how come in some jurisdictions they have cameras and in my jurisdiction, in my neighborhood, they don't?
I would say that local governments have to be able to afford it. And I would say that in various communities you have different dynamics and relationships and satisfaction with the police and their performance. And so I think that you really have to look at this community by community, and it has to be a priority for a community. If it's a priority for a community, it will be funded. And so that's really, I don't think that the mandating the laws will produce the kind of result that some people think it will. In South Carolina, there is a bill to mandate. I would oppose that bill, and I would oppose it because I think that, again, it forces people to do something that they may not yet be prepared to do. They may not roll out and implement properly, and the damage that can come from that can actually outweigh the cost of the program and the benefits.
I think additionally, the community has to be involved in the process. From the standpoint of a lot of community members don't want cameras mandated on them for some of the privacy issues that have been described up here as well. When you globally force an issue, there's going to be pushback from a lot of different sectors. When you slowly roll something out and have voluntary input, not only from the police, but the public that is being served, which is a huge factor here. I think everybody is a little bit easier in the transition phase if it's voluntary on both sides.
If I could add, I think aside from rollout and buy-in, which are obviously key concepts, it's very important that those are led by people who believe in what you're doing. One of the serious limitations of the NYPD's current pilot is that it's completely voluntary, which I think limits how impactful the data that comes out of that pilot can be, because the officers who are signing up for it maybe are not a representative sample of the entire force.
So just a second question. So on the last panel, Dr. Kesey was talking about one of the comments from Dr. Dolores Jones-Brown over at John Jay on review and interpretation of videos. So kind of the second phase of this process. The evidence is recorded, then the video evidence has to be reviewed. And Jones-Brown said, as quoted by Dr. Kesey, that not everyone has the same lived experience in talking about the review process of film. So are there recommendations around practices that we can set up to be sure that communities have faith in the tape review process?
And I'll go back to, again, citizen oversight. There has to be some type of auditing process of your policy practices, all your training, everything that's going on. The body camera program is just a tool. It's a window into what's going on in the entire police department. And I'll take everybody back to one of the first video incidents that is world famous that Ms. Rice should be very familiar with, and that's Mr. Holliday's video, the Rodney King incident. And it showed a cross-section of total organizational accountability failures of that entire incident, up into where Mr. Holliday was trying to turn over that video to the Internal Affairs Division of the LAPD, and they wouldn't accept it. At least that's my understanding. And you have brand new officers who are in a training program, who are riding with field training officers who we tell our personnel, this is who we want you to emulate. You have a sergeant who is supposedly the backbone of the organization out there who tells a watch commander, we just had a big time use of force, and there's no additional inquiry about it. So to me, if you have correct civilian oversight that has some type of random auditing system that's looking at your videos, use of force incidents, whatever it is, different reporting systems that you have in place, hiring practices, everything, on and on and on, listening to your tapes of how your dispatchers interact with individuals who are calling in for calls of service. Civilian oversight provides you a separate set of eyes and ears into what's actually going on into your policing. And the final thing I want to say, it's one thing to deliver policing services, it's another thing to sample the service that you deliver.
In Charlotte, I served 21 years there, 4 years in Greensboro, and now just 6 months really in Greenville. But all three cities had civilian oversight of some kind. And in Greensboro, I can tell you that the citizen oversight, I pushed to expand the power of that citizen oversight. It was only focused on incidents of racial or ethnic bias, and we allowed them to review all complaints that might be appealed in terms of the outcomes from a citizen, and also they received complaints and they ensured that we investigated them. There's another group in Greensboro that's been very active that seeks subpoena power, discipline authority, and the ability to do their own independent investigation, but basically the whole nuts and bolts. And I would say that the groups that seek that kind of review of police action would be very harmful to policing, be very harmful to community safety, because I think it will cause political shifts, and so officers will become much more politically driven in terms of what they do or don't do. And I think that that would be a mistake in policing and for community safety. But with respect to reviewing video, I don't know of any cities that may have policies or practices in place that have some sort of an audit function that involves citizen review, meaning that the panel comes together with police and they do some random audit of videos. That is something that occurred to me that might be useful if again the group is properly trained and it's properly appointed and prepared to do that work. If you have citizen review in place that's not prepared, you have chaos. So you have to understand not only the perspectives of the community, but you have to understand the framework under which police act.
Well, thank you very much. Let me ask the task force members to help me thank this panel for all of their comments.
Let's make one comment, just. I just wanted, it's interesting, we're talking about a piece of equipment that maybe the assumption would be that everybody has seen. So even though my eyes are getting less accurate at my older age, I do notice that the sergeant here is wearing one. So just for anybody who hasn't seen one, maybe you can point it out for us, Rick?
I see.
Get an idea of what we're talking about, where just so
not at the
perception
moment.
is reality.
So you're recording
Can you inform us whether it's on or off right now?
It's off right now, but it's been on and off throughout the day.
You're going to have quite a record of us, I assume.
No different than C-SPAN.